A single phone call can decide the lives of hundreds of thousands, and this very call happens deep underground, in the Führerbunker in Berlin, where Adolf Hitler, a trembling wreck, grabs the receiver and screams at his last general, "Wenck, attack! Hang anyone who does not fight! Save me!" Any other officer would have said, "Yes, sir," and sent his men to certain death. But General Walther Wenck does the unthinkable. He hangs up the phone, turns to his officers, and says the sentence that makes him the greatest traitor of the Reich and the greatest hero of humanity. It's not about Hitler anymore. It's not about Berlin anymore. We are turning around and saving the people. What follows is not an orderly retreat, but the bloodiest, most desperate, and heroic rescue mission in history, where an army of children and old men runs against the strongest military power in the world, not to win, but to keep open a corridor through which 250,000 civilians can escape death. To understand the full magnitude of this madness, we must imagine the state of this so-called Army Wenck in April 1945, not as a military unit on a map, but as a physical reality in the mud of Brandenburg. Because what operated under the proud name 12th Army was in truth a cabinet of curiosities of misery, thrown together from the last remnants of a bleeding nation, a ghost army that shouldn't even exist. The divisions bore great names like Scharnhorst, Ulrich von Hutten, or Theodor Körner, but inside the uniforms were not soldiers, but 16-year-old boys of the Reich Labor Service. Children whose faces were still soft and beardless, wearing helmets that slid over their eyes with every step, dragging carbines almost as big as themselves. Next to them hobbled old men of the Volkssturm, grandfathers in civilian clothes with armbands, coughing, their hands shaking so much they could barely push a cartridge into the barrel. Equipped with captured weapons from French and Belgian stocks, for which there was often no matching ammunition. There were no tanks, no heavy Tigers or Panthers that formed the backbone of a German offensive. Instead, they rode on bicycles, on requisitioned farm wagons, or in old trucks powered by wood gas generators that stalled on every incline, so the soldiers had to get off and push, while Soviet attack aircraft circled overhead like vultures waiting for carry-on. This army had no gasoline, no radios, no field kitchens. They fed on raw potatoes they dug out of the fields, and on the little bread civilians slipped them. And yet, despite this hopeless situation, despite the cold, despite the hunger, this army followed its general. Because Walther Wenck was not one of those sitting in the bunker. He was a man marked himself, wearing a supportive corset after a severe car accident, in pain with every movement, but standing with his men at the front, in an open car, his face gray with exhaustion, but with eyes burning with determination, not for victory, but for rescue. The attack begins on April 24th, and it is brutal, chaotic, and marked by a savagery that shocks even the Soviet veterans. Because Wenck's child soldiers do not attack according to the rules of warfare. They simply storm forward, without cover, without artillery preparation, driven by the mortal fear for their mothers and sisters waiting in the Elbe pocket. One must imagine the scene near Belitz, where a group of Hitler youths on bicycles, armed only with Panzerfausts, encounters a column of T-34 tanks. The Russian tanks turn their turrets, machine guns bark, but the boys do not retreat. They pedal, zigzagging through the muzzle fire, throw their bicycles into the ditch, crawl through the mud, and fire their deadly charges at point-blank range. A young grenadier, barely 17 years old, jumps onto the rear of a Soviet tank with 2 bundled charges. He knows he will die, but he detonates the charge, blowing up the tank and himself to clear a crossroads, while next to him an old man from the Volkssturm lies behind an MG42 and fires until the barrel glows, the oil evaporates, and the hot casings burn his face. It is a battle of David against Goliath, flesh against steel, despair against overwhelming power. And the unbelievable happens. They actually punch a breach. They tear a hole in the iron ring of the 1st Ukrainian front near Furch. They create a connection to the trapped 9th Army. And through this needle's eye, this narrow corridor of life, barely wider than a few kilometers, the exodus begins immediately. A stream of pure misery rolling like a festering wound through the burning pine forests. It is not a march. It is a stumbling, crawling, and dragging. A migration of the damned, where military order and civilian chaos mix. Wounded soldiers whose bandages haven't been changed for days and who stink of pus, gangrene, and burns support each other, limp on self-carved crutches, or let comrades pull them on tent sheets. Next to them, women push prams through the deep mud churned up by tank tracks. Prams that hold no babies, but the last remnants of their lives. Photos, some silverware, a loaf of bread, a crucifix. The noise is deafening and omnipresent. The howling of the Stalin organs firing their rocket salvos into the forest mixes with the screaming of children, the neighing of dying horses, and the roaring of officers trying to keep the mass moving. Because every standstill means death by Soviet artillery, firing mercilessly and blindly into the dense crowds, knowing full well it causes the most damage there. Shells strike the refugee treks, tearing apart horses, wagons, and people. Body parts fly through the air and hang in the trees. The ground is covered with corpses over which the living simply have to step because there is no other way, driven by the panic, the all-consuming fear of the Red Army's revenge, of rape, of deportation to Siberia. In the middle of this inferno, Wenck is the rock in the surf. He does not sit in a safe bunker. He stands in the mud at the crossroads, his uniform dirty, his voice hoarse from shouting. He directs traffic. He personally pulls civilians out of the ditch. He screams orders into his radio. Hold the flanks. We need 24 more hours. Just 4 more hours to get them all out. His soldiers on the flanks die by the minute. They are overrun by Soviet tanks, hunted by low-flying Il-2 attack aircraft strafing the columns with their cannons. But they do not retreat. They dig in. They fight with spades and knives when the ammunition is gone. They form a living wall of flesh and blood to keep the corridor open. Not for the Führer, but for the woman with the child limping past them right now. The destination of this death march is the Elbe near Tangermunde, the river of hope, but also the river of despair, where a destroyed bridge juts out of the gray, cold water like a warning, broken skeleton. And on the western bank stand the Americans, weapons at the ready, watching stunned through their binoculars what is happening on the other shore. Hundreds of thousands of people crowd together on the riverbank, a sea of heads reaching to the horizon. There are no boats, no ferries, no bridge, only the freezing, rushing water and the debris of the railway bridge, over which one must climb like an ant over a broken branch, balancing over the abyss under constant fire. The scenes on the bank are apocalyptic and defy description. People who have lost their minds from exhaustion and madness throw themselves into the river in desperation, trying to swim, swept away by the current, drowning under the weight of their wet clothes and backpacks, their bodies drifting away like driftwood. Mothers tie their children to their backs with ropes and belts and climb barefoot over the slippery, bent steel girders of the bridge, cutting their feet on sharp edges, while Russian snipers from the edge of the forest begin to fire at the climbers, and the bodies of those hit slap into the water, coloring the Elbe red. Wenck organizes the crossing with a coldness and hardness necessary to control the total chaos and prevent mass panic. He orders that civilians and the wounded have absolute priority. He posts military police who force back any healthy soldier trying to cut in line or hijack a boat at gunpoint. He threatens execution, not out of cruelty, but to protect the weakest. The Americans on the other bank, the 9th U.S. Army under General Simpson, are initially enemies. They have orders to let no one through. But when they see through their optics the scale of the humanitarian catastrophe, when they see the women, the children, the torn bodies, they are overwhelmed by pity. They cease fire and begin to help. They ignore their orders. They send their own assault boats over. They throw ropes. They pull drowning people out of the water. They take in the refugees, not as prisoners of war, but as castaways of humanity. The days pass like a time lapse. May 4th, May 5th, May 6th. The corridor gets narrower and narrower. The Red Army presses from north and south with overwhelming power. The 12th Army is compressed like in a vice. The ammunition is gone. Soldiers fight with stones. They throw themselves with their bodies in front of the tracks of tanks to slow them down. They sacrifice themselves man for man, meter for meter, to buy another hour, another minute for the crossing. On May 7th, the end is reached. The last civilians are across. The East Bank is a gigantic, ghostly scrapyard of thousands of abandoned vehicles, weapons, steel helmets, suitcases, prams, and family albums. A graveyard of German history, where the remnants of a perished civilization pile up. Walther Wenck stands on the bank. He is one of the last. He is completely exhausted. His uniform is torn. His corset rubs him raw. His face is black with soot and dirt. He looks back at the mushroom cloud of smoke over the forests where his rearguard is dying right now, where young men are giving their lives so he and the last survivors can board this boat. He steps into the last small boat. He rows across. The water splashes in his face, and when he steps onto American soil, he draws his pistol, not to shoot, but to hand it over. He hands it to an American sergeant. He is now a prisoner, a general without an army, a defeated man in the eyes of world history. But inside, he knows he has achieved something no other general in this damned war has managed. Neither Rommel, nor Patton, nor Zhukov. He has saved 250,000 human lives. 250,000 souls who would have been ash without him. But what became of the man who performed this miracle? The story of Walther Wenck did not end on the banks of the Elbe. After his capture by the Americans, he was taken to a camp, interrogated, and finally released. But he did not return to a grateful homeland as a celebrated war hero, because Germany wanted to forget. It wanted to bury its generals, its uniforms, and its past. Wenck, the man who had saved 250,000 people, became a civilian, a simple citizen in a country trying to reinvent itself. He traded the general's uniform for a suit, the binoculars for file folders, and began a second life in business, far away from tanks and artillery. He worked hard, rose up, became the managing director of a large industrial company, Diehl in Nuremberg, and if you met him on the street in the 1960s or 70s, you saw only a friendly, older gentleman with a correct haircut and alert eyes. You would not guess that this man once ordered, "Do not attack Berlin, save the people." He rarely spoke about the war. He wrote no memoirs to justify or glorify himself, as so many other generals did. He did not seek the limelight, because he knew the true story was not in books, but in the faces of the people he had saved. Yet fate, which had carried him through the hail of bullets in Russia and the inferno of 1945, held a final, cruel punchline, an irony almost too bitter to be true. On May 1st, 1982, exactly 37 years after he dissolved his army and sent the last refugee across the Elbe, Walther Wenck was traveling in Austria. He was driving on a country road near Riedem-Innkreis. Perhaps he was thinking of nothing in particular. Perhaps he was enjoying the landscape, when his car, for unexplained reasons, went off the road and crashed against a tree. The man who had looked death in the eye 1,000 times on the battlefield, the man Stalin organs and snipers could not kill, died lonely and suddenly in a metal wreck on a peaceful spring day, killed by a profane traffic accident. His death was worth a short notice in the newspapers. But his true monument does not stand in a cemetery. It is not made of stone or bronze. His monument is the millions of people, children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren of those refugees who live, breathe, love, and work today, and who would never have existed without his decision on that day in the Führerbunker. Walther Wenck was no saint. He was a general of Hitler, a part of the machine. But in the darkest hour of his life, he decided to stop the wheel. And perhaps that is the most important lesson he left us, that it is never too late to do the right thing, even when the world around you is in flames. Rest in peace, General of Hearts.